The comments were moving so fast I could barely read them. He finally found his perfect match. This is what true love looks like. Some people are simply happier after divorce. I should have closed the live stream. Instead, I watched my ex-husband, Ethan, straighten the collar of his navy suit as a violin quartet played behind him. The rooftop restaurant glittered with lights, champagne glasses caught the sunset, and every familiar face from our old circle seemed to be there. Friends who hadn't spoken to me in months were smiling into their phones, broadcasting what they called the most romantic proposal they'd ever witnessed. 10 days. That was all it had taken. 10 days after the judge signed our divorce papers, Ethan was already on one knee in front of the woman he'd insisted was just a friend. When she held out her hand, the crowd erupted. He slipped the ring onto her finger. She nodded, laughing through fake tears. Everyone cheered. Then the camera zoomed closer. I froze. "No," I whispered. For one impossible second, I thought exhaustion was playing tricks on me. Then I looked again. The angle changed. The sunlight caught the left side of her face. And I burst into laughter. Not because I was jealous. Not because I wanted Ethan back. I laughed because I knew exactly who she was. Or rather, I knew exactly who she used to be. The laughter startled even me. It echoed through my apartment until I abruptly covered my mouth. My phone vibrated almost immediately as more congratulatory messages filled the live stream. They're absolutely perfect together. She seems so genuine. Ethan deserves someone who actually appreciates him. That last comment stayed on the screen just long enough to sting. During the divorce, Ethan had been careful to control every conversation. According to him, I was suspicious, emotionally distant, and incapable of trusting anyone. By the time everything was finalized, most of our mutual friends had quietly accepted his version of our marriage. Invitations stopped coming. Calls became shorter. People looked at me with polite sympathy, as though I were the woman who had thrown away a good husband. I reached over and muted the live stream. The room fell silent, except for my own breathing. "If that's really you," I murmured to the screen, "what are you doing here?" I opened my laptop and logged into the encrypted archive from my former compliance investigations. It had been years since I'd accessed those files. Hundreds of cases appeared on the screen, each identified only by numbers and restricted classifications. My fingers hesitated above the keyboard. Before typing the case reference, I never thought I'd revisit. Seconds later, an old investigation folder opened. Inside were interview summaries, financial records, surveillance notes, and dozens of photographs collected during an executive fraud inquiry that had nearly destroyed an entire company. I scrolled carefully. Hair color had changed. Her style was completely different. The surname attached to Ethan's fiancée wasn't the one in my records, but the tiny crescent-shaped birthmark just below her left ear. It hadn't changed. Neither had the smile she always wore in every archived photograph. Calm, confident, impossible to forget once you'd seen it. Outside my apartment window, the city carried on as if nothing had happened. Inside, I could hear my heartbeat growing louder with every document I opened. Meanwhile, my phone continued lighting up with notifications from people celebrating Ethan's engagement. A former neighbor shared photos from the proposal. Someone else wrote that Ethan had finally found the woman he was always meant to be with. No one had any idea what I was looking at. I returned to the first page of the investigation file. A full-page photograph stared back at me. The woman smiling beside Ethan under a shower of applause was the very same woman whose face had once appeared in one of the most confidential investigations I'd ever worked. And in that moment, one terrifying question refused to leave my mind. What if Ethan had absolutely no idea who he'd just proposed to? I didn't sleep that night. The engagement live stream had ended hours earlier, but the woman's face stayed fixed in my mind. I sat at my dining table with my laptop open, the old case file on one screen and Ethan's engagement photos on the other. Either I'm wrong, I said quietly to myself, or this is about to become a disaster. I had spent 14 years working in corporate compliance. My job wasn't to jump to conclusions. It was to verify facts, challenge assumptions, and never accuse someone without evidence. So I forced myself to start from the beginning. I enlarged one of the engagement photos. Then I opened an archived conference photograph from the old investigation. Different hairstyle, different makeup, different wardrobe, but the same habit of tilting her head ever so slightly whenever someone pointed a camera at her. I wasn't looking for similarities anymore. I was trying to prove myself wrong. Instead, every comparison made me more certain. As I worked through the files, memories I had tried to bury resurfaced. The final year of my marriage suddenly looked different. Ethan had started traveling more. Their client meetings, he'd always say while tossing another shirt into his suitcase. "You've had 6 client dinners this week," I once replied. He sighed dramatically. "See, this is exactly what I'm talking about." "What do you mean?" "You always assume something's wrong." "I'm asking a question." "No, you're investigating me." He laughed as if I were being ridiculous. By the end of the conversation, I always found myself apologizing. Not because I'd done anything wrong. Because somehow he could make ordinary questions sound like accusations. One evening from that year came back with startling clarity. Ethan had returned from what he called a financial leadership conference. While helping him unpack, I'd noticed a hotel receipt. The conference had ended on Friday morning. The receipt showed he'd stayed until Sunday afternoon. "Did they extend the conference?" I'd asked. Without looking up from his phone, he'd answered, "Networking. For 2 extra days." He shrugged. "You wouldn't understand how business relationships work." Something about his tone bothered me. Not because he stayed longer. Because he dismissed the question before I'd even finished asking it. When I mentioned it again a week later, he smiled in that patient way that made everyone think he was the reasonable one. "Thelma," he'd said, "do you ever get tired of looking for problems that don't exist?" Eventually. I did. Not because my instincts disappeared. Because I stopped trusting them. Back in the present, I pulled up the travel timeline from the old investigation. Several conference dates immediately stood out. I opened Ethan's old calendar backups that had been preserved during our divorce paperwork. My stomach tightened. 3 of his unexplained business trips overlapped with conferences where the woman in my files had also been documented attending under her previous surname. The dates alone proved nothing. Professionals crossed paths at conferences every day. Still, the pattern refused to leave me alone. I leaned back and rubbed my temples. "Did you know?" I whispered. "Or did she find you the same way she found everyone else?" That question mattered. If Ethan knowingly helped her deceive people, warning him would be pointless. If he didn't, he was walking straight toward the same trap I'd once investigated. For nearly an hour, I stared at my phone. His contact information was still there. One message. "That's all it would take. We need to talk." I even typed it. Then I deleted it. Why would he believe me? The last time I'd tried to warn him about someone, he'd laughed. The last time I'd trusted my instincts during our marriage, he'd called me paranoid. After the divorce, he'd convinced almost everyone else of the same thing. If I contacted him now, 10 days after he announced his engagement, it would look exactly like everyone already expected. The bitter ex-wife trying to ruin his happiness. "No," I said firmly, locking my phone. "I'm not doing this. Whatever happened next, it wasn't my responsibility." I closed the investigation folder for the first time that evening. Before I could stand up, my phone rang. The caller ID stopped me cold. "Martin Hale." My former investigations supervisor. We hadn't spoken in almost 4 years. I answered cautiously. Martin. His voice was calm, almost amused. I was wondering how long it would take before you recognized her. I was wondering how long it would take before you recognized her. Martin's words hung in the silence. I gripped the phone tighter. So, I'm not imagining this. No, he replied, you aren't. I looked back at the photograph on my laptop. Why didn't anyone stop her? Martin let out a slow breath. Because there wasn't enough to prosecute. There was enough to raise alarms, enough to make companies protect themselves, but every individual case ended before it reached court. The victims wanted their lives back, not headlines. And she's using another surname. She always adapts. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Martin added, the question isn't whether you've identified her. It's whether Ethan knows who he's engaged to. Over the next few days, Ethan's engagement seemed impossible to escape. Everywhere I looked, someone was talking about it. A business podcast released an interview titled Starting Over After Divorce. Ethan smiled confidently into the camera. The hardest part, he told the host, is realizing that sometimes two good people simply aren't compatible. Eventually, you meet someone who makes everything feel effortless. The host smiled. And your fiancée. He looked toward her proudly. She's the most genuine person I've ever met. I closed the video before it finished. Not because the words hurt anymore. Because every compliment pushed him one step closer to making decisions he couldn't undo. Martin called again that afternoon. I've spoken to 2 of the former victims, he said. They're willing to help. They're willing to confirm facts if they're ever asked. Nothing more. Why stay silent for so long? They rebuilt their lives. Public attention would have cost them more than they wanted to lose. He paused. But they kept everything. What do you mean? Emails, contracts, financial records, identity documents, every piece of evidence they collected before walking away. I closed my eyes. They knew someone else might need it someday. Exactly. That Friday evening, I attended a birthday dinner for one of our old mutual friends. I'd considered declining. Instead, I decided I was tired of hiding. The conversation flowed easily until someone mentioned Ethan. Oh, have you seen the engagement pictures? Melissa asked, holding up her phone. They're gorgeous. Around the table, everyone nodded. Another friend laughed. They look like they've been together forever. Then Melissa looked directly at me. You know. She hesitated for only a second. I heard you laughed when you saw the announcement. The table went quiet. Someone shifted uncomfortably. Another person avoided eye contact. Finally, Melissa shrugged. I guess that's one way to deal with heartbreak. Across the table, Daniel smirked. Or bitterness. A few people chuckled. I reached for my glass of water instead of responding immediately. Then I set it back down. I'm curious, I said calmly. Melissa frowned. About what? I looked around the table. Has anyone actually verified who she is? No one answered. Daniel crossed his arms. What does that even mean? I mean exactly what I asked. Silence settled over the room. Finally, one woman, Rachel, cleared her throat. Actually, everyone turned toward her. I thought it was odd. Melissa looked surprised. Odd how? Rachel hesitated. I tried finding pictures from before a few years ago. And there weren't any. Daniel rolled his eyes. So, Rachel continued carefully, there were no old classmates commenting, no family photos, no childhood friends, no college pictures. Her online history basically begins out of nowhere. Melissa laughed awkwardly. Some people value privacy. They do, Rachel agreed. But most people don't erase an entire past. Nobody spoke after that. The confidence that had filled the conversation only minutes earlier had disappeared. Not because I'd accused anyone, because I'd asked a question no one else had considered. When I returned home, Martin's earlier advice echoed in my mind. Facts. Only facts. No speculation. No revenge. I contacted him once more. If the people from the old investigation are still willing. They are. I'd like permission to use their documentation if Ethan's advisors ever need proof. I'll ask. Within an hour, my inbox began filling with replies. Every former victim said the same thing in different words. If verified evidence can prevent someone else from losing everything, you have our permission. I wasn't gathering ammunition. I was building a factual record. Whether anyone chose to believe it was another matter. That evening, Ethan uploaded another video. He stood beside his fiancée with 2 glasses of champagne. She smiled at the camera. He slipped an arm around her shoulders. I've got one more exciting announcement, he said. She squeezed his hand. We've decided there's no reason to wait. He grinned. Next week, we're officially combining our finances and planning our future together. My heart sank. Because if the old pattern repeated itself, he had just started the clock. The announcement hadn't been online for more than 20 minutes when my phone rang. It wasn't Martin. It was an unfamiliar number. I almost ignored it. Instead, I answered. Hello. A woman spoke before I could say anything else. Is this Thelma Brooks? Yes. My name is Karen. There was a long pause. I was told you recognized her. I immediately knew who she meant. You were involved in the old investigation. I was one of the people who didn't listen to the warnings. Her voice carried the kind of exhaustion that only came from experience. When I heard they were combining finances next week, I knew I couldn't stay quiet anymore. Karen agreed to meet me the following morning. She arrived carrying a slim accordion folder that looked almost worn through from years of being opened and closed. She placed it carefully on the cafe table. I've never shown this to anyone outside my attorney. I nodded. You don't have to explain anything you don't want to. I know. She slid the folder toward me. But Ethan deserves a chance I never got. Inside were neatly organized copies of contracts, bank authorizations, emails, and signed financial documents. Everything was dated. Everything had been preserved. Karen pointed to one timeline she'd created years earlier. It always started the same way. She traced the sequence with her finger. Fast romance. Another line. Engagement. Another. Shared financial planning. Then another. Access to business accounts. Finally, she reached the last entry. Relationship collapse. No dramatic accusations. No emotional language. Just a pattern documented over time. I closed the folder slowly. It matched the investigation I'd worked years before almost perfectly. By the time I returned home, 3 more former victims had emailed additional records. Each file stood on its own. Different cities. Different years. Different names. Yet the progression barely changed. Rapid commitment. Request for shared financial access. Promises about building a future together. Complicated transfers explained as temporary necessities. Then, the relationships unraveled, leaving confusion, financial disputes, or costly legal battles behind. Not every situation had ended the same way, but the similarities were impossible to ignore. I sat back from my desk. This was no longer about recognizing a familiar face. It was about preventing history from repeating itself. I looked at Ethan's contact information again. Not to message him directly. That wasn't the right approach. If I reached out now, emotion would become the story instead of evidence. So I called my attorney instead. I need a favor. What happened? I explained everything carefully, sticking only to facts. When I finished, she asked one question. Do you have documentation? Years of it. Verified. Every document comes from original records or former victims who preserved their files. She was quiet for a moment. Then don't send anything to Ethan. I wasn't planning to. Good. Who should receive it? People whose job is to evaluate evidence, not emotion. That afternoon, I assembled a single organized package. No personal opinions. No accusations. No emotional commentary. Just verified documentation. Identity records showing the prior legal surname. Conference attendance records. Corporate investigations summaries that could legally be shared. Statements from former victims. Financial timelines. Every page was labeled and sourced. I sent identical copies to Ethan's attorney and his longtime financial advisor. Then I closed my laptop. There was nothing more I could do. The decision was no longer mine. The hours crawled by. No phone calls. No emails. No confirmation that anyone had even opened the files. By evening, I convinced myself they dismissed everything. Then I noticed something strange. The engagement video had disappeared. I refreshed the page. Nothing. I checked Ethan's profile. The announcement photographs were gone. Every celebratory post had vanished. Friends who had been congratulating the couple only hours earlier were suddenly asking confused questions. Did something happen? Why was the engagement post deleted? Is everything okay? No one answered. Rumors began spreading almost immediately, but I refused to read them. Facts had gotten us this far. Speculation wouldn't help now. I shut my phone off and made myself a cup of tea. For the first time in days, the apartment was completely quiet. I carried the mug toward the living room. Then, a sharp knock echoed through the apartment. Another. Then a third. I opened the door. Ethan stood there. His suit jacket was wrinkled. His tie was gone. The confidence I'd watched on the live stream had disappeared. He looked older than he had a week earlier. He held a thick envelope in one hand. I've spent the last 6 hours with my attorney, he said. His voice was steady, but only barely. He looked directly at me. Tell me everything. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The man standing in my doorway was almost unrecognizable from the one who had smiled into a camera and announced to the world that he'd found his perfect match. I stepped aside. Come in. Ethan entered quietly, setting the thick envelope on my dining table. He looked around the apartment as though he hadn't noticed it during the divorce. There were no framed wedding photos anymore, no reminders of the life we'd built together. Only silence. I'll answer your questions, I said, but I'm only going to talk about facts. He nodded once. I deserve that. I opened my laptop and brought up the archived investigation. This is the case where I first encountered her identity. At the time, she was using a different legal surname. I turned the screen toward him. He stared at the photograph. His face slowly lost its color. I've never seen this. I didn't expect you had. I clicked to the next page. There wasn't enough evidence for criminal charges. That's why you won't find headlines. But there was enough documentation for companies to protect themselves and for the people involved to quietly settle their financial disputes. He leaned closer. Every page answered a question before he could ask it. Conference records, identity documents, public filings, chronological timelines. Nothing sensational. Nothing exaggerated. Just carefully preserved evidence. Then I opened the statements from the former victims. Each one described a remarkably similar sequence of events. A whirlwind romance. An engagement that moved unusually fast. Encouragement to combine finances. Requests for access to business information. Promises that everything would be easier once their futures were fully connected. The details differed from relationship to relationship. The pattern did not. Ethan sat back in his chair. I thought, he stopped, searching for the words. I thought I was proving everyone wrong. I looked at him quietly. What do you mean? He gave a humorless laugh. After the divorce, people kept asking whether leaving you had been worth it. His eyes dropped to the table. I wanted this engagement to answer that question. He rubbed his forehead. I wanted everyone to see that I hadn't made the biggest mistake of my life. Instead, he had rushed to prove something to everyone else without asking whether he truly knew the person standing beside him. My attorney verified the identity records this afternoon, he said. My financial advisor compared your documentation with the information she'd given me. He swallowed hard. They found inconsistencies I never questioned. He reached into the envelope and removed several papers. The engagement is over. I simply nodded. There won't be a wedding. Over the following week, additional reviews uncovered several undisclosed legal disputes connected to his fiancée's previous identity. None of them alone told the whole story, but together they revealed exactly what my old investigation had suggested years before, a repeating pattern that raised serious concerns. Before any joint accounts were created, before any property transfers were signed, before any long-term financial agreements became legally binding, the relationship ended. She left without another public statement. Within days, every trace of the engagement disappeared from her social media accounts. She didn't defend herself publicly. She simply vanished from Ethan's life as quietly as she had entered it. The aftermath spread through our mutual circle far more slowly than the engagement announcement ever had. The same friends who had praised Ethan's perfect match began calling me. Melissa spoke first. I owe you an apology. You don't owe me anything, I replied. I judged you. Yes. I thought you laughed because you were bitter. I smiled faintly. I laughed because I recognized something no one else did. One by one, other conversations followed. People admitted they'd accepted Ethan's version of our marriage without ever hearing mine. Some apologized. Some were too embarrassed to say much at all. I didn't ask any of them to defend me. The facts had already done that. Ethan's professional life wasn't untouched either. Several long-term clients questioned why he had ignored obvious gaps in his fiancée's background before making major financial plans. A few partnerships ended, not because he had committed wrongdoing, but because people began questioning his judgment in high-stakes decisions. It was a painful lesson, one he admitted he had brought upon himself. A month later, he called me one final time. I need to say something. I'm listening. You warned me for years when something didn't make sense. I stayed silent. I kept calling you suspicious. Another pause. The truth is, you were paying attention. I was. I'm sorry. There was no anger left in his voice. Only acceptance. For years, I had imagined hearing those words. When they finally came, they didn't change my life. They simply confirmed what I had already learned on my own. I accept your apology, I said. But it doesn't change where we are. I know. He didn't argue. He didn't ask for another chance. When the call ended, it felt like the final page of a chapter that had been closing long before our divorce. Months later, I was promoted to lead a corporate risk investigation team. During the announcement, my director smiled and said, "Your greatest strength has always been noticing what everyone else overlooks." Years earlier, I would have apologized for being cautious. This time I simply said, "Thank you." I no longer questioned every instinct. I no longer assumed I was imagining patterns that weren't there. Experience had taught me the difference between suspicion and discernment. One is driven by fear. The other is built on evidence. Looking back, people often assumed the happiest moment in my story was when Ethan's engagement ended. They were wrong. The happiest moment came when I stopped needing anyone else to tell me that my judgment was trustworthy. Because the woman everyone thought had taken the best thing from my life never actually won anything at all. She had only revealed what I should have believed years earlier. I hadn't lost my future. I had simply watched someone else almost inherit my past.